Welcome to Prime Suspects. Alongside Adam Bjorn and Prime Sports co-founder Joe Brennan Jr., I'm your host, Matt Landis. Adam, it was a turbulent weekend on the gridiron, with two top 10 college football teams dropping out of the poll in the same week for the first time in 39 years, and three NFL favorites of more than a touchdown losing outright. So from Texas getting chumped by the Gators at Florida, and Penn State awakening the Bruins from hibernation, losing as 24.5-point favorites at UCLA, resulting in the preseason numbers 1 and 2 now being unranked, to the NFL and losses by the Rams, Cardinals, and Bills, throwing a wrench into survivor pools, with the Rams and Cardinals being the two most picked teams in Circa Survivor and wiping out more than half the remaining field. All in all, how did the chaotic football weekend that was net out for you on both sides of the counter?
So for us, I was looking through the numbers. College football and NFL weren't great north of the border, but obviously we have Betcris in Latin America, which had really good results. So I think it's a pro versus Joe's kind of shake-up of how it actually all fell together. You know, those big upsets which normally take out, and which we'll see in the future where the FanDuel DraftKings had big weekends, I imagine they probably did. Our player base is a little bit different, so those results fall a little bit differently. And our player that usually falls into some of those things escaped them, so Ohio wasn't as rosy and green as we could have when some of those things happen. It was a challenging weekend, as I said, north of the border, just based on the results and the player base that we have.
And beyond everything that took place across the football landscape this weekend, UFC 320 went down on Saturday as one of the year's biggest cards. Adam, how did that go for Prime Sports and Betcris? And more broadly, how would you characterize the popularity of MMA based on the action you're taking?
I mean, it's sort of been one of the growing sports. You know, it was a really good weekend volume-wise, result-wise. I think we won small overall. Nothing variance between different states or different countries or anything of that nature. But MMA's just been growing and growing. And as I said, for a long time, if you're a new bettor to the landscape and that, and you have a inkling or a liking for MMA, it's the product where markets are inefficient, limits are really good. And if you're really wanting to sort of lean into this and grow your bankroll, MMA is kind of one of those spots. But it's, for years it's been growing. The weekend again saw a pump in the numbers and the volume in the card that it was. And yeah, it was another good weekend of the UFC, and we won small across the board.
And Joe, let's bring you into the fold here as well. We've got baseball's postseason in full swing. Wondering what your top takeaways would be from a wild card round that lived up to the name, with 3 of 4 series going the distance, as well as the first couple days of the division series.
I mean, I think everything's set up as it should. Now we're in the division series. It's amazing how quickly the futures markets have moved on that. Dodgers for most of the season were taking in the Lions action. They were by far the strong favorite until September, when Philadelphia went on its run. So in a lot of markets, it was Philly was either first or very close second to Dodgers. It only took one game for the Dodgers to really kind of reassert their dominance, and for Philly to practically drop off a cliff. Come on, guys, I'm a Phillies fan, and even I'm not that dire. But it's interesting to see how much, I guess going 2-0 up on a nice public team like the Yankees would do anything to improve the action on Toronto. Toronto's a strong second in World Series futures here right now. I hate saying that because I'm still angry about 1993 and Joe Carter. The team I'm surprised still isn't getting the love or the respect is the Brewers, who are basically playing, a division. How many times do they have to beat the Cubs this year for people to believe? And they've best record in baseball. It's not a mistake. So just looking at how the markets, I think now, the Yankees going down 2-0 against Toronto, you're only going to see more public Joe money probably flow into the Dodgers vats. But let's see what happens in game 2 of that series in Philadelphia to see if there is anything to merit, Philadelphia tightening that one back up.
And just as the jam-packed sports calendar keeps humming along, so too does the prediction market news cycle. And with that, Kalshi launched parlays last week, and we saw DraftKings and Flutter stocks drop about 8% on that news. Joe, some have suggested the response was overblown, while others, such as Spruce Point Capital, warned that Dan King's stocks face 35 to 60% downside. Considering the writing had been on the wall that Kalshi would roll out something like this, what do you make of last week's sell-off?
Well, I'm definitely in the overblown camp. Anybody who was clutching their pearls about that on Monday just hasn't been reading the news. There must be some really lazy ass analysts out there if they were somehow caught unawares by that. And then as far as Spruce Point Capital's comments, well, nobody gets their name in the Wall Street Journal or in Bloomberg by making moderate statements on market movements like that. So, of course, predicting like the worst possible downside. But I mean, look, everybody saw it coming because Kalshi told the market, this is what we're going to do. The product is still kind of like, okay, yeah, now there's parlays, but their parlay product is so far behind the current market offering of the state licensed and regulated products that, I mean, will they get there? Yeah, probably, I guess, at some point. But what I found interesting last week was as much as the market was clutching its pearls and dropping the share prices on Monday, they really weren't paying attention to other things that developed during the week, like, internally, the CFTC's enforcement division didn't really seem all that committal in their internal memo regarding prediction markets, where they more or less said, hey, look, our licensees are doing this, they're self-certifying this, but we haven't okayed it. And these guys might still be on the hook when it comes to state regulators. And they're going to have to show that they can shut down action coming from any state where state regulators say this isn't permitted. So that was kind of a bad note. And then ended the week with a U.S. District Court judge in Nevada refusing to issue a preliminary injunction for the guys over at crypto.com, which was incredibly weird because he's the guy who permitted the preliminary injunction for Kalshi and basically a carbon copy matter to offer sports prediction markets. But I would say the news was decidedly mixed last week. Anybody who was looking for clarity about the future of prediction markets probably wasn't helped. I don't know that it was entirely hurt. There's still a lot of time on the clock to see which way this one goes, but the market definitely overreacted. And I wish I had a couple of bucks I could have thrown into those two stocks to make a quick bump turnaround on it.
And Adam, given the pace and volume of news in the prediction market space these days, how do you go about balancing keeping up with what you need to know so you can respond accordingly versus putting up blinders and staying in your lane as a regulated sportsbook operator?
It's just a lot of overblown noise. I mean, they've said for a while they're going to try and put up this product. So what? I mean, FanDuel, DraftKings, MGM, Caesars, whoever else. At the end of the day, they don't give a rat's ass about sports betting. It's just what they have right now until they get the, more states opening up for iGaming. Exchanges have been around for a long time. They've come, they've gone. It is probably more suited somewhat to the US market if they can convince them that it is more like buying and selling stocks. It's just a lot of hoopla and whatnot. As to what we're looking at and what we're doing, you can't take any notice of it. It's just you'd be getting whiplash if we were sort of riding every high or every low or anything of that nature. And it's just, again, trying to get more customers that want to bet sports and find them a place that they can place their wager and not have any friction as they're withdrawing money or anything of that nature. Win, get paid, sweat the game, not the payout, bringing some old school terms back into the business. I think we're almost prediction marketed out. As Joe said, if they're going to take big dips on this kind of news in the market, then we should be cash ready and looking to jump in, because DraftKings, FanDuel, they're not going to take a major hit from prediction markets in the long term. They've got their player base. They're adding verticals, and who knows, maybe they end up adding a vertical in this space and then take away some of that market share that's being put into Robinhood, Kalshi, Poly markets, whatever else. So much ado about nothing, and we'll just push forward and keep trying to take bets.
If we can draw attention to one thing, though, that last week proved, is that I think prediction market Twitter has definitely jumped the shark. It has become the most ridiculous cesspool of people who are discovering betting on sports for the first time. Apparently, Kalshi is like the Gutenberg press, the internet, and the A-bomb all at once. It's amazing watching smart kids learn something for the first time, like when my kids discovered the moon for the first time.
Well, guys, and more news that could affect the leading regulated sportsbooks across the United States. The Massachusetts Gaming Commission last Tuesday put the so-called ban or bankrupt model under the microscope. And Joe, Commissioner Maynard expressed a desire to have limited bettors, quote, removed from the penalty box and have their limits restored. What do you make of this in theory, and what do you make of it in practice?
Well, you can understand why Massachusetts is one of our nation's great factories of ice hockey players with that kind of reference, which I really appreciated. It sounds very interesting, It's an interesting notion. I don't think it's one that's really been discussed before, but the mechanics are everything. How exactly does a player get themselves out of the penalty box? Do they lose more? I don't know. The thing that's encouraging, granted, I mean, the Massachusetts regulators, their conclusions was a bit like, the sky is blue and water is wet. But it was really important that a key regulator noted this publicly, said this publicly, and that they are trying to debate about the need for solutions because they agree there has to be a solution for this kind of thing. So that's encouraging. Clearly, they got to go back and workshop this thing a little bit, but the more ice hockey references out of Massachusetts, the better.
I will say, as a born and raised Southern Californian, the Beanpot, still the best sporting event I've ever taken in live. So, Joe, I'm with you on the power of hockey in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And Adam, Commissioner O'Brien also suggested that books establish a range of maximum and minimum bets for each market, a notion that's been well received by pro bettor Spanky, among others. What do you make of this concept, and what other ideas would you suggest to realistically drive meaningful change?
Wow, what a unique outlook on this. I mean, the min-max, minimum bets laws, all those kind of things. I mean, it's just another thing where maybe they're bored and looking for something to talk about. How are they going to enforce this on operators? What markets are they going to do it on? Living on both sides of the counter, I've experienced, 30 years of being limited and not so much of limiting from our side versus the rest of the market. I read through what Spanky had to say, and it's all good in theory, but in reality, it's one thing or another. Yes, there should be some minimum bet limits in certain spots, but then you're going to have the operators crying that, the states are going to lose taxes out on this because now they've got to take professional bettors and all this kind of hoopla and noise. And then it's going to take one dip in a state's, just result-wise happening that they get less taxes than what they got the previous, or the hold went down 0.5%, and they're going to think this is the big bad wolf coming after their taxes. There's just a lot of hoopla and noise, and it'd be great if they could actually get someone in there to sort of structure it and put some things in place, but it's fantasy right now in this marketplace. And I think overall, there's prediction markets. You can go out there and get bets on prediction markets and sweeps and all these other things. There's so many things wrong with this entire industry right now across the spectrum of what they're fighting and what they're up against. Worrying about the professional bettors, and again, being one, isn't something that they really should be targeting right now or really giving two shits about.
I think Massachusetts could do, and this is going to sound a little self-serving, but fuck it, I'll be self-serving. And I saw this from a couple of people making these comments online in the wake of all this, is Massachusetts could certainly lower the costs of licensing in their state so that operators like Prime, like Betcris, like Circa would be able to afford to go to that market and service those customers. I mean, trying to force feed FanDuel and DraftKings customers that they don't want, they'll find a way to reject them. That's the sad part about it. I worry about the cynical use of responsible gaming measures and other things in order to keep these guys out of the market, even if they were required to have like minimum betting limits, penalty boxes, etc. But if they're only going to make the ability to access the Massachusetts market available to the Cokes and the Pepsis, and they're not going to allow small little microbrewery artisanal brands like ours to be able to access the market, to give people a product that they can access without getting limited. Look, the answer is really not that hard if they want it to be. But if they just want to keep charging these huge upfront sunk cost prices to access Massachusetts, this is what they're going to get. They're going to tie themselves into knots trying to come up with a solution that in the end, the big recreational sports books will find a better way in order to block those players.
On top of that, having had a previous life in the unregulated market, Massachusetts has a very, very, very strong base in that unregulated market. So, people not having to go to the regulated books that they provided have great opportunities to play at other places because of, what's been established decades ago. So if they really want to regulate their entire market, as Joe said, be self-serving, bring it in to a level where others can compete on a business level, and we'd have our hands up in that opportunity. But yeah, they've priced themselves out of the market for us right now.
Well, to your point, Adam, people have a lot of options in terms of where they can play, but wherever they play, we can bet that the NFL will be a big part of a lot of bettors' portfolios for the foreseeable future. So using that to bridge us to our weekly NFL look ahead, What's the most noteworthy action you've seen across the Week 6 slate so far?
Broncos. Last week, and I probably should have brought it up in our first segment, shouted from the rooftop that the Cowboys were the play of the week last week in multiple locations. And sure enough, that was probably the easiest win of the week, unlike some of my circa survivor picks. But so far, it's been the strongest money out of the week. And the other big bet game is the Patriots over the Saints. So, Saints finally get their win in a, crappy looking game. Patriots, I think, are just going to go in there and run over the top of them this week.
And I know I can be as guilty as anybody of getting tunnel vision when it comes to the NFL. When it comes to the college football slate, after a dynamite list of marquee matchups a couple weeks ago, not the most exciting slate this past weekend, but as things pick back up this coming Saturday, college football or anything else beyond the NFL, Adam, early on in this week, is anything popping in terms of the action you're seeing at Prime Sports and Betcris?
No, I saw a bit of money coming in on the Alabama-Missouri. Seemed like it was the biggest bet game so far this week on the college. Baseball, unfortunately, us in New Jersey, Prime can't take Detroit Tigers action, so they're kind of limited there. Hopefully they do not see the World Series. A couple other games that we're seeing decent money on was Wake Forest and Oregon State, oddly enough, is probably the biggest bet game this week so far.
A game only a sharp would love. Holy smokes.
All right, well, as a USC grad, I was wondering if USC Michigan would pop up there, but maybe that will come into play a bit more as the week unfolds. In the meantime, we can go ahead and tie a bow around episode 102 of Prime Suspects, and to the audience, whether chaos continues to reign supreme or order gets restored in terms of this week's result across football and the rest of the sports betting landscape, you can always count on us to bring a degree of order and stability to your weekly podcast consumption routine. Thanks as always for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Prime Suspects. Register for Prime Sports at primesports.com and download the Prime Sports app. You can follow us on Twitter at PrimeSuspects_, at Joe Brennan Jr., and at Adam Bjorn 2. You must be 21 or over to play on Prime Sports. Always bet responsibly and within your limits. If you or someone you know has a gambling problem, call 1-800-GAMBLER.